Think about the moment after a huge event, like the end of a major war. There's relief, sure, but it also kicks off this massive economic reshuffling.
Yeah, industries have to pivot, people want different things. All of a sudden, it's a really tricky balancing act.
And if you're listening, you're probably someone who wants to get a handle on these big economic shifts, quickly and really understand them.
Well, today we're diving deep into exactly that kind of period.
Uh,
The 1948-1949 recession in the U.S.
right. And we're digging into a 1956 case study for this one from the National Bureau of Economic Research.
That's the one. It really dissected this whole post-war downturn. So our mission today is basically to figure out what caused it, what it actually felt like, and, well, what policymakers tried to do.
And hopefully pull out some broader insights about how economies wobble.
Exactly. How these fluctuations work more generally.
Okay, let's unpack this.
Yeah.
The late 1940s, just after World War II. You'd think it was all champagne and parades, economically speaking.
Mm.
But our source points to this kind of underlying worry and unease. Why were people feeling hesitant when things seemed, on the surface, to be booming?
Well, what's fascinating is the realization back then that a huge chunk of the demand, both here and, internationally, was just catch-up demand.
Like pent-up demand from the war years finally being released.
Precisely. Think about everyone wanting a new car, a new fridge, after years of rationing and factories focused on war production. That creates a massive but temporary surge.
All right.
And layered on top of that, you had pretty significant inflation. So things looked busy, but there were these fundamental questions sort of bubbling underneath.
People wondering if the party would stop once everyone got their new washing machine. Would, normal demand be enough to keep everything humming along?
Exactly that. Could normal demand sustain full employment once those backlogs were cleared? That was a big one. And then the inflation fears.
Yeah.
Had it created damaging imbalances, like between prices and what people could actually afford, or between production costs and selling prices for businesses?
And wasn't there also a historical angle? Like, big inflations often end badly.
Right. History suggested that major inflationary periods could, and often did, lead to a pretty sharp downturn, so that precedent was looming.
The source mentions some strengths built up during the 1930s, these sort of economic shock absorbers. But the question was hanging there. Were they strong enough?
Yeah, were they robust enough to handle this kind of massive post-war adjustment? So even with what looked like a solid foundation, there was this nagging feeling that some kind of rebalancing was inevitable.
It really makes you think about what genuine economic stability involves, doesn't it?
It does. Even with good fundamentals, these big disruptions and imbalances, they create vulnerabilities. The study acknowledges those strengths from the 30s, but it rightly questions if they could fully cushion such a huge shift.
Okay, let's jump to 1948. This is where we start seeing hints that maybe things aren't quite so rosy. What were those early signs?
Well, you started seeing more goods becoming available. Shelves were filling up, imports were coming in.
Supply catching up with demand.
Exactly, and that naturally started putting some downward pressure on prices, especially farm prices initially. That shift from scarcity to availability is often a critical turning point.
So you could actually find stuff in stores again. And maybe prices weren't climbing quite so fast in some areas. What about consumers? Were they still spending like there was no tomorrow?
That initial post-war buying frenzy, it started to level off. A few reasons for that.
Like,
Well, people had mostly bought the big things they'd been waiting for. Also, consumer credit had gone up quite a bit, and people were starting to push back against high prices, maybe saving a bit more like they used to, becoming more cautious.
makes sense. You only need so many new toasters. And businesses. Were they still investing like crazy, building factories?
Private fixed investment. So, yeah, new plants, new equipment that started showing a slight downward trend, just a slight one, but it suggests businesses were maybe pausing, getting a little hesitant.
Sensing the peak, perhaps?
Maybe sensing the rapid growth couldn't just keep going indefinitely at that pace.
Okay, so the pace is slowing. Then we hit the actual downturn, late 48 into 49. And the source makes this really crucial point. The big swings weren't necessarily about final sales, but about inventory, what businesses had on hand.
That's a critical insight, absolutely. The growth in final sales slowed down before total output actually started to decline.
Oh, okay.
And the main thing driving those big swings in GNP, gross national product, was inventory changes. The study highlights this starkly. A $10 billion drop in GNP at an annual rate corresponded with roughly a $12 billion drop in business inventories between late 48 and late 49. mostly non-farm inventories, about $10 billion of that.
$12 billion worth of stuff just vanishing from stockpiles, basically. Businesses cutting back hard.
Exactly. They'd built up these big stockpiles, demand softened, so they slammed the brakes on adding more and started drawing them down. Huge impact on overall activity.
But it wasn't all negative, right? The source mentioned some offsetting factors.
Right, yeah. Interestingly, while things like spending on non-durables and producers' equipment went down, people actually bought more durable goods, cars, appliances, and spent more on services. Plus, government purchases increased too.
So a mixed bag within the overall decline. Why the drop in non-durables specifically?
Seems largely tied to those price pressures we talked about earlier, and the drop in producers' equipment. Probably that business hesitation, reassessing future needs.
The timing of all this seems really key. When did things actually peak? New orders, sales.
Okay, so new orders across the board peaked in June 1948. Overall business sales hit their high point in August 48.
But not uniformly.
No, there's nuance. Durable goods manufacturers. Their sales peaked later, December 48. Non-durable manufacturers peaked earlier, back in June 48. Retailers, both durable and non-durable, saw sales peak in December 48 as well. And here's a key thing. The rate of sales growth in 1948 was already slower than in 1947. The momentum was clearly fading even before the peaks.
So the engine was losing steam. And those inventories we keep coming back to, when did they hit their absolute highest point?
Total business inventories just kept climbing through 1948. They finally peaked in February 1949.
Okay.
Now, the rate of increase was slower than in 47, but this time it was a real buildup of physical stuff, not just higher prices making the value go up like it had been in 47.
Where was this buildup happening most?
Mainly in finished goods, sitting in manufacturers' and retailers' warehouses. And it was bigger in manufacturing, especially durable goods manufacturing.
And inventory peaks also varied by sector?
They did. Durable manufacturers peaked, like I said, Feb 49, but non-durable manufacturers, their inventories peaked way earlier, October 1947. Durable retailers peaked Dec 48, non-durable retailers Sep 48.
Wow, quite staggered. Shows different dynamics at play.
Definitely suggests these inventory adjustments were rolling through the economy at different speeds.
Okay, now let's shift to industrial production, the actual factory output. You'd think post-war that would be roaring ahead. But the source says 1948 was surprisingly sluggish.
Yeah, compared to the really rapid growth in 1947, industrial production grew much more slowly in 48. It hit a modest peak in July, then started trending down.
Any difference between sectors?
Durable manufacturing was a bit more vigorous than non-durables, but overall, yeah, growth was pretty muted.
And the thinking at the time was that this was because factories were just maxed out.
Right.
Capacity constraints.
That was the common belief, yes, that we just couldn't physically make stuff any faster. But looking back,
Hindsight is 20/20.
exactly, it's pretty clear the real issue was weakening demand. Production could have gone higher, but the sales weren't there. That assumption of operating at full capacity, it just wasn't quite right anymore.
Okay, so prices and jobs, always crucial indicators. What was the story there in 48?
Wholesale prices were a mixed bag. Farm prices peaked early, first quarter, then fell. That reflects the increasing supply.
Right.
Industrial commodities, though, they kept rising, hit a new post-war high in November, mostly metals. Consumer prices, heavily influenced by food, dipped early, peaked in August, then started to ease off.
And jobs. Was unemployment shooting up?
Actually, no. Average unemployment in 48 was slightly lower than 47. The labor force even grew.
Huh. So the labor market seemed okay.
On the surface, yes. But there was a warning sign near the end of the year, fourth quarter 48. Layoffs started cropping up in non-durable goods industries and some consumer durable sectors, too. So even with okay overall numbers, cracks were starting to appear.
Right. So what were policymakers thinking and doing amidst all this? The Fed, the government.
While the Federal Reserve was laser-focused on inflation, they were advocating a pretty strong anti-inflation program.
Like what?
Things like boosting productivity, asking for a pause on wage demands, running a budget surplus to pay down debt, giving the Fed more power over bank credit, pushing savings bonds. They really saw price controls as just a temporary fix, not the real solution.
Did they actually do anything? Tighten policy?
They did start nudging up short-term interest rates in mid-1947, but then, kind of confusingly, in November 47, they stepped in to support long-term government bond prices.
Which works against tightening, right?
Yeah.
Because it potentially fuels credit expansion.
Exactly. It created this tension. They were worried about inflationary bank credit. Then, summer 48, They brought back Consumer Credit Controls Regulation W and hiked bank reserve requirements.
But hang on, summer 48,
Yeah.
wasn't the economy already starting to slow then? The timing feels off. Like that source quote about locking the barn after the horse was stolen.
That nails it. The Fed was still clearly worried about inflation. You can see it in their August 48 bulletin. But yeah, the boom was already fading, so these moves to cool things down might have maybe inadvertently pushed the slowdown along.
Interesting. But even within the government, wasn't there some recognition that things were shifting? Like in the official economic reports?
Yes, definitely. By January 49, the economic report was talking about diverging price trends, some up, some down, and noting weakening consumer demand. That's a clear shift from the July 48 report, which was much more worried about ongoing inflation.
And the Council of Economic Advisors.
By April 49, they were forecasting a price readjustment with maybe just a moderate temporary dip in jobs and output. Still a bit worried about inflation, but definitely acknowledging the change.
So, despite the data hinting at a slowdown, the main narrative through mid-48 was still danger, inflation ahead. Why did they seem to misjudge that turning point?
The study suggests a few reasons. One is historical inertia. They'd been expecting a big post-war crash for years, and it hadn't happened. So maybe they were sort of conditioned to keep focusing on the inflation risk, even as the signs changed. Crying wolf about recession had been wrong before.
Ah, the boy who cried wolf effect. Makes sense. What else?
International tensions and the budget. 1948 was dicey globally. Greece, Czechoslovakia, Italy, the Berlin blockade,
Right, Cold War heating up.
which created pressure for more defense spending, and that threatened the big federal budget surpluses that had been the main weapon against inflation.
So, geopolitics complicated the domestic economic picture. Made inflation seem like a bigger ongoing risk, maybe?
Could be. Higher government spending, even if the private sector was weakening, might look inflationary. And finally, just politics.
How so?
It's just hard for governments to quickly pivot their public stance and policies when the economic data starts shifting underneath them.
Yeah.
There's an inevitable lag.
Like turning a big tanker ship, yeah.
Yeah.
Takes time. And once price controls were gone, the main tool left was the budget surplus, but you said the timing was off.
Pretty much. The big surpluses happened mainly because of the earlier inflation pushing up tax revenues, and they were largest in 48, right when that strong anti-inflationary pressure was maybe less needed or even counterproductive.
And the inflation bursts before 49 were kind of short and sharp.
Yeah, they tended to be over before the government could really react with fiscal policy, and bringing back price controls quickly just wasn't practical.
Okay, so 1949, officially recession year. How bad was it? What did it look like statistically?
The main hit to GNP was really in the first quarter of 49. Things kind of leveled off in the second half. Overall, GNP fell about 4% from the peak in late 48 to the end of 49.
Only 4%. That sounds relatively mild for GNP.
Overall GNP, yes, but consumer spending barely dipped, less than 1%. The pain was concentrated elsewhere.
Okay, where were the big drops?
Consumer spending on durables fell 5%, non-durables down 3%. But the real crater was private domestic investment, down a whopping 32%.
Wow, nearly a third.
Yeah. Within that, business spending on equipment fell 12%, new construction down 8%. Total business sales dropped less than 10%, but manufacturer sales down 18%.
At 32% investment drop is huge. Really shows businesses pulling back sharply. What about inventories? Did those stockpiles finally shrink?
Yep. Total business inventories by book value fell about 7% from that February 49 peak to the end of the year. Most of that reduction was in manufacturing.
But you mentioned retailers' inventories were more stable?
In real terms, yes. After accounting for price changes, their physical stock levels didn't fluctuate nearly as much.
Why the difference? Why did retailers hold on to stock more?
Could be a few things. Maybe customers shifted the inventory burden back onto suppliers as stuff became easier to get.
Yeah. Just in time. Wasn't quite the thing yet, but retailers could rely on faster deliveries.
Possibly. Or suppliers kept stock high for prompt shipping. Maybe manufacturers were just reluctant to dump goods at lower prices or couldn't cut production fast enough.
And the recovery within 49, it wasn't synchronized, was it? Some sectors turned up sooner.
Definitely not. Retail sales hit bottom in January, then stayed pretty flat. Consumer spending, especially on durables, bottomed in Q1 and started rising. Housing starts jumped sharply in Q2.
So consumers and housing led the way out.
It looks like it. Corporate profits bottomed in Q2, but only recovered moderately after that. Manufacturing didn't really pick up until September. Business investment, equipment, and inventory definitely lagged behind.
And the source floats with an interesting what-if about policy, Regulation W, and reserve requirements.
Yeah, it asks, what if those hadn't happened? Regulation W restricted installment credit, hiking reserve requirements, tightened money for housing. Maybe the recession wouldn't have been exactly the same without them. It's a fair question. Impossible to know for sure, but worth considering.
Now, how did economists interpret all this at the time? What were the competing theories?
Well, the majority view in the US, according to our source, was that this was basically an inventory cycle, a kitchen cycle, relatively mild, short term, driven by businesses adjusting stock levels.
Just a normal inventory correction,
That was the main view here. But there was a minority view, more popular over in Britain and Europe, that blamed underconsumption.
meaning not enough demand from people to buy everything being produced.
Exactly. A lack of purchasing power or willingness to spend.
And the source author tries to bridge these two views.
Sort of, yeah. They offer a more nuanced take. They suggest maybe the root cause was the changing growth rate of consumer spending, but the recovery happened without some huge injection of purchasing power?
So how did it recover then?
Maybe just
Yes.
temporary buyers' fatigue wore off, or consumers used up their own household inventories of soft goods and started buying again. It's an interesting idea combining inventory and underconsumption, but focusing maybe on consumer inventories of needs, not just business stockpiles.
Interesting perspective. Were there other factors people pointed to, like trade or government spending?
Yeah. Some folks wanted more focus on U.S. exports, international trade effects, and on fiscal policy. Government spending did go up in 49, the budget surplus shrank. Some argued that helped the recovery.
Did the source author agree?
They seemed a bit skeptical that those were the decisive factors, but acknowledged the widespread belief, especially abroad. Lots of people overseas thought cuts in U.S. exports or military spending caused the recession, and later increases fixed it.
And they missed the actual timing of the recovery.
Largely unaware, the recovery started well before the Korean War buildup, yeah. Many attributed avoiding a deeper depression simply to the war.
What about prices during the recession? Did the government actively prop them up?
The source suggests it was more luck than active policy that prices didn't fall much during the recession itself. Fortuitous is the word used.
But they might have stepped in if things got worse.
Probably. The author speculates that price supports would likely have come in early 1950 if needed, and that business, agriculture, labor, they were probably counting on the government stepping in eventually.
Always good to remember the data changes over time, too. Were the initial numbers different from what we know now?
Yes, the revised stats show smaller declines in GNP and industrial production for 49 than the first figures did.
So it looked a bit worse in real time than it actually was.
Potentially, yes. Plus, officials would have seen some encouraging signs, like steel and auto production picking up mid-49, which might have reassured them somewhat.
One last detail that caught my eye, that point about personal saving in 1948. The big jump wasn't really consumers saving more?
Correct. That's a fascinating clarification. The big rise in the total personal saving figure was apparently entirely due to saving by unincorporated businesses and farms, which gets counted in that category.
Not Joe Public suddenly socking away tons more cash.
Exactly. Actual saving by individual consumers, non-business saving, was relatively stable. So the narrative of consumers drastically tightening their belts in 48, a bit misleading based on this analysis.
And finally, the source author offers a slightly more positive view on what monetary policy could do.
Yeah, a bit more hopeful perhaps than the original NBER study author might have been. A sense that central banking, working alongside fiscal policy and debt management, does have potential to help stabilize things. Not a magic wand, but a useful tool.
Okay, so wrapping this up, this deep dive into 48-49 shows a really complex picture. Post-war adjustments, inventory playing a huge role, shifts in demand.
Absolutely. And policy responses struggling with diagnosis and timing. It's definitely not a simple boom-bust story.
No, much more nuanced. And this history gives us really valuable insights into how downturns work, the challenges of navigating them. It highlights how crucial it is to look at a wide range of indicators and how tough the job of policymakers actually is in real time.
Couldn't agree more. Understanding these past episodes helps us analyze the present.
Right. And thinking about today, as 2025, we've got our own mix of uncertainties, trade tensions, geopolitical stuff, shifting labor markets. What lessons from this post-war readjustment period, this 48-49 experience, might be most relevant for us now as we try to anticipate, what comes next? Definitely something to chew on.